Something astonishing unfolded in a lecture hall at Stanford University, an event so incredible it became the greatest clash of minds anyone had ever witnessed. Barron Trump, towering and composed, stepped into a world ruled by Dr. Leonard Graves, a man whose name alone sent shivers down spines. This wasn't just a classroom, it was a battlefield, a place where ideas were torn apart, where faith was mocked, and where no one escaped unscathed. What happened next was beyond imagination, a moment so wild, so unexpected, that it left everyone speechless. But that secret, that earth-shattering twist, wouldn't reveal itself right away. First, the stage had to be set, the players introduced, the tension built to a breaking point. Dr. Leonard Graves wasn't an ordinary professor. He was a force of nature, a spectacle wrapped in intellect and arrogance. His lectures weren't lessons, they were performances, electrifying displays of wit and power that drew crowds far beyond the university's walls. At Stanford's philosophy department, he reigned supreme, a king in a kingdom of thought. His sharp mind cut through arguments like a blade through paper, and his sharper tongue left students trembling. Clips of his debates flooded social media, where millions either hailed him as a fearless warrior of reason or cursed him as a heartless tyrant who delighted in crushing belief. His reputation grew larger than life, a legend built on the ruins of shattered convictions. Every semester he began the same way. The first day wasn't about syllabuses or introductions, it was a test, a gauntlet thrown down to see who could withstand his scrutiny. His eyes would sweep the room, hunting for targets. A cross necklace glinting on a student's chest, a hijab neatly pinned, a yarmulke perched atop a head, these were his invitations to strike. He'd lean forward, smirking, his voice dripping with challenge, daring someone to step into his arena. Students knew what was coming. Some braced themselves, others shrank into their seats, but all felt the weight of his presence. He thrived on their unease, feeding off the tension like a predator sizing up prey. His method was simple but brutal. He'd dismantle faith piece by piece, exposing its flaws with surgical precision. To him, belief was a puzzle to unravel, a clock to take apart until nothing remained but scattered gears. He asked questions that lingered in the air, heavy with implication, designed to make even the strongest falter. He relished the stumbles, the nervous laughter, the awkward silences that followed. Students rarely walked away intact. Some abandoned their beliefs entirely, others learned to hide them, burying their convictions deep where his piercing gaze couldn't reach. For years, he played this game, perfecting his craft, turning his classroom into a theater of intellectual carnage. Beyond the university, his colleagues spoke of him with a mix of awe and dread. Brilliant didn't cover it. He was unstoppable, a master of debate who turned arguments into traps. Step into a discussion with him and he'd twist words until the ground beneath vanished, leaving opponents stranded in their own confusion. His mind worked like a maze, guiding people down paths they didn't see until it was too late. Admiration came grudgingly from those who knew him, but so did caution. He was a storm, unpredictable and relentless, and no one dared stand too close when the lightning struck. Yet beneath the bravado, a mystery lingered. Why did he despise faith so fiercely? Whispers circulated among students and faculty alike. Some guessed he'd been raised in a suffocating religious home, a childhood spent under strict rules that he later rejected with fury. Others imagined a tragedy, a loss so profound it turned his heart against anything divine. He never spoke of it. His past remained a locked vault, hidden behind walls of logic and scorn. All he let slip was his conviction. Faith was a lie, a dangerous illusion that needed to be destroyed. Year after year, he waged his war, breaking down believers with a smile, certain he'd never meet his match. Then Barron Trump walked in. At 19, he wasn't just a student, he was a presence, a figure who commanded attention without effort. Standing at 6'7", he towered over the room, but it wasn't his height that stood out. It was his calm, his stillness, an unshakable demeanor that set him apart from the fidgeting, distracted masses around him. He didn't slouch over a laptop or scribble frantic notes. He sat upright, listening, processing, his face a mask of quiet strength. Weeks passed and he stayed silent, an enigma in a sea of eager voices. But one detail caught the professor's eye: a silver cross necklace, simple yet bold, hanging against his chest. It was a beacon, a challenge, and Dr. Graves couldn't resist. The day arrived. The lecture hall buzzed with anticipation, packed with students, some enrolled, others just there for the show. The whiteboard declared the topic: faith in the modern world, a rational foundation or a relic of the past. Dr. Graves leaned against his desk, sleeves rolled up, his smirk signaling the storm to come. Barron took his seat near the center, unassuming yet impossible to ignore. The professor's gaze roamed the room, then stopped. No necklace rested on Barron's chest that day. The smirk widened. This was it, the opening he'd been waiting for, the chance to strike. The room held its breath, sensing the collision about to unfold. What happened next would defy every expectation, turning a routine lecture into a moment etched in memory. The air in the lecture hall thickened as Dr. Leonard Graves prepared to unleash his attack. Barron Trump sat steady, a rock amid a rising tide, unaware, or perhaps fully aware of the storm barreling toward him. What transpired that day wasn't just a debate. It was a seismic event, a clash so intense it would ripple beyond those four walls. Something monumental was brewing, a twist so astonishing it would leave jaws on the floor, hearts pounding and minds racing. But the brilliance of it all lay in the buildup, the slow burn of tension that made the payoff even sweeter. Dr. Graves had spent weeks studying Barron, waiting for the perfect moment. The missing necklace was his spark. He straightened, his voice cutting through the room like a whip, loud enough for every ear to catch it. He mocked the absence of the cross, implying it had been a mere prop, a hollow symbol discarded when it no longer served its purpose. A few students let out nervous chuckles, the kind that bubble up when danger looms too close. They knew the professor's game. He'd bait his target, then dismantle them, piece by piece, until nothing remained. This was supposed to be another victory, another notch on his belt. But Barron didn't play along. He didn't fidget. He didn't blush or stammer. His eyes locked onto Graves, calm and unyielding, as if the professor's words were nothing more than a breeze passing through. The room waited, braced for the usual collapse, a flustered response, a weak defense, anything Graves could pounce on. Instead, Barron's reply came like a thunderclap, steady and clear. He turned the mockery back on Graves, suggesting that the professor's need to point out the missing necklace revealed more about him than it did about Barron. It was simple, direct, and devastating. The smirk on Graves' face flickered, a crack in his armor so brief most missed it, but not Barron. Silence gripped the room. It wasn't the quiet of boredom or disinterest. It was heavy, electric, the kind that follows a sudden shift in power. Students who'd been doodling or scrolling snapped to attention, eyes darting between the two figures. Graves leaned back against his desk, arms crossed, forcing his smirk to return. He couldn't let a 19-year-old unsettle him, not in his domain, not in front of his audience. He nodded, acknowledging the cleverness, but quickly pivoted. Faith, he argued, was a performance, a crutch for the weak, propped up by symbols and rituals that crumbled under scrutiny. Strip it all away, and what remained? Nothing worth defending, he claimed. Barron didn't rush to respond. He tilted his head, considering the words as if they were a puzzle to solve, not a weapon to dodge. Then he struck again, his voice even, his point sharp. Conviction, he said, was what lingered when the props were gone. Graves laughed, a short, dismissive sound countering that conviction meant nothing without evidence. People could be convinced of anything, he insisted, from fairy tales to flat planets. It didn't make those things true. The professor's confidence swelled, certain he'd regained the upper hand. He paced slightly, his tone growing bolder, his argument tightening like a noose. But Barron wasn't done. He leaned forward just enough to draw every eye and shifted the ground beneath Graves' feet. What about love? The question hung there, simple yet piercing. Love couldn't be weighed or measured, couldn't be pinned down in a lab, yet people built their lives around it, died for it, cried for it. Did that make it an illusion? A murmur rippled through the class, soft but undeniable. Graves opened his mouth, then paused, a hesitation so brief it might have gone unnoticed, except it didn't. Barron saw it. The professor's rhythm faltered, his certainty shaken by a single word. Recovering, Graves pushed back, his voice sharper now. Love was different, he argued, a human experience grounded in observable actions, not some unseen force ruling the cosmos. But Barron pressed harder. Why did faith bother Graves so much? Why did the beliefs of others gnaw at him, drive him to this relentless crusade? The question wasn't loud or aggressive. It was calm, deliberate. A blade slipped quietly between ribs. For the first time, something flickered in Graves' eyes. Irritation, maybe. Discomfort, perhaps. Or something deeper, something buried. He snapped that he didn't care, that his mission was to challenge, to force critical thought over blind acceptance. His words carried an edge, a hint of defensiveness he couldn't quite mask. Barron didn't flinch. He countered that Graves assumed all faith was blind, a leap into darkness with no reason behind it. But faith, Barron suggested, was about trusting in something bigger, even without every answer in hand. Graves scoffed, calling it a pretty excuse for superstition, a dodge for those too lazy to seek truth. The professor regained his footing, packing now, his voice rising as he reclaimed control. He'd debated sharper minds than this, he reminded himself, pastors, scholars, theologians, and always emerged victorious. This was his arena, his rules. He wouldn't stumble now. Yet the room felt different. Students weren't just listening, they were watching, sensing a shift they couldn't name. Graves had spent years reducing faith to rubble, scattering it with a flick of his wrist. Today, though, the rubble didn't fall so easily. Barron's words lingered, unshaken by the professor's barbs, planting seeds of doubt, not in faith but in Graves himself. The lecture hall buzzed with unspoken questions. Could the unbreakable Dr. Graves be rattled? Was this quiet, towering student more than he seemed? The clash had only begun, and already the ground was trembling beneath the professor's feet. The lecture hall at Stanford pulsed with tension, a pressure cooker ready to burst. Dr. Leonard Graves, the untouchable master of debate, faced Barron Trump, a young man whose quiet strength was rewriting the script. What was unfolding wasn't just a discussion, it was a reckoning, a moment so staggering it would echo far beyond that day. Something unbelievable was on the horizon, a climax so explosive it would redefine everything, but the path to it twisted through layers of doubt, defiance, and raw emotion. The tide was turning, and no one, not even Graves, could predict where it would land. Graves adjusted his stance, his mind racing to reclaim dominance. He'd faced tougher opponents, he told himself, seasoned scholars who'd crumbled under his logic. This was a kid, a novice, nothing more. He exhaled sharply, packing the room, his voice cutting through the silence. Faith, he declared, was a house of cards, believing without seeing, trusting without proof. What stopped anyone from inventing nonsense and calling it truth? He scanned the class, daring them to disagree, his smirk creeping back as he steadied himself. This was familiar territory, his kingdom, and he'd rule it as always. Barron sat still, unruffled, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. He didn't leap to his feet or raise his voice. He simply watched, waiting, letting Graves' words settle like dust before stirring them up again. Then he spoke, his tone measured but firm. Evidence wasn't just numbers on a page, he argued. People leaned on invisible things every day: justice, morality, rights. Societies rose and fell on those ideas, yet no one could hold them in their hands. Were they illusions too? The question landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading through the room. Graves smirked, quick to counter. Those concepts were human-made, he insisted, built on reason and agreement, not some mystical overseer pulling strings. Religion demanded blind leaps into the unknown, and that's where it failed. He crossed his arms, satisfied, certain he'd plugged the hole Barron had punched in his armor. But Barron didn't back down. He nodded slowly, as if conceding a point, then turned it back on Graves. If something existed beyond human creation, something too vast to fully grasp, would Graves dismiss it simply because it couldn't be proven? The professor's jaw tightened, his confidence fraying at the edges. Sensing the shift, Graves pivoted, his tone growing sharper. Love came up again, Barron's earlier jab still stung. Graves scoffed, brushing it off as a weak comparison. Love showed itself in actions, he argued, not in vague promises of eternity. Barron cut in, his voice steady. Actions proved love, yes, but love itself couldn't be dissected or quantified. Neither could morality or hope. Did that make them less real? A few students exchanged glances, their notebooks forgotten, drawn into the unfolding drama. Graves wasn't losing, not yet, but he wasn't winning either, and that alone was a shock. The professor regrouped, his mind a whirlwind of strategy. He refused to let this slip away. Fine, he conceded, some things defied measurement, but that didn't validate faith. It didn't prove a higher power wasn't just a comforting story for the fearful. Barron tilted his head, his gaze piercing. What if it wasn't a story? What if faith pointed to something real, something Graves couldn't disprove? The burden of proof, Barron suggested, wasn't just on believers. What if Graves was wrong? The room shrank, the air growing tight, every eye locked on the professor, waiting for his next move. Graves blinked, caught off guard. He masked it fast, crossing his arms, his voice cool but strained. Logic didn't work that way, he insisted. If he claimed a dragon lived in his basement, no one had to disprove it, he had to prove it. That's how reason won. But Barron didn't budge. He leaned forward, his words deliberate. Graves wasn't arguing logic, he said. He was arguing certainty, a certainty so absolute it bordered on its own kind of faith. A gasp might have escaped someone in the back, though no one could be sure. The room buzzed, alive with unspoken tension. Students straightened, their attention razor-sharp. Barron pressed on, his voice calm but relentless. Graves acted as if doubt only belonged to believers, as if his own worldview was flawless. But everyone trusted in something, Barron argued, science, reason, even cynicism. The difference was Barron owned his faith, while Graves hid his behind a mask of skepticism. The professor's scoff came fast, but it lacked its usual bite. He accused Barron of dodging, of admitting faith was just a feeling, nothing solid. Barron's expression didn't waver. Everyone had faith, he said, atheists, scientists, philosophers. The question was where they placed it. A student near the back shifted, her hand creeping up. She wore dark-rimmed glasses, a philosophy major known for her own sharp mind. Her voice broke the stillness, cautious but bold. Did Graves ever doubt himself? The question hung there, simple yet lethal. Every head swiveled to the professor. His jaw clenched, his fingers curling slightly. He couldn't dodge this, not with dozens of eyes boring into him. A wrong answer could unravel everything, painting him as the rigid zealot he despised. He exhaled slowly, running a hand across his chin. He didn't deal in absolutes, he said finally, his voice low. He questioned everything. Barron nodded, seizing the moment. Then question this, he urged. Why did faith rattle Graves so deeply? The silence that followed was deafening. For years, students had watched Graves shred arguments, leaving opponents in pieces. Today, though, the pieces weren't falling his way. Something had shifted, a crack forming in the professor's unshakable facade. The lecture hall pulsed with a new energy, a sense that this wasn't just a debate. It was a mirror held up to a man who'd never looked into one before. The tide had turned, and the real storm was still to come. The lecture hall at Stanford University had transformed into something far more than a classroom. It was an arena, a crucible where intellect and conviction collided with ferocious intensity. Dr. Leonard Graves, once the undisputed ruler of this domain, now stood on uncertain ground. His iron grip slipping as Barron Trump's quiet resolve shook the foundations of everything he'd built. What was happening wasn't just a debate. It was a seismic upheaval, a moment so charged with raw power that it promised to explode into something unforgettable. The air crackled with anticipation, every student leaning forward, sensing that the greatest revelation, the most jaw-dropping twist, was still lurking just out of sight, waiting to strike. Graves had always thrived on control. For years, he'd orchestrated discussions like a conductor leading a symphony, guiding students into corners where surrender was their only option. His lectures were legendary, his victories countless, his reputation a towering monument to reason's triumph over superstition. But now that monument trembled. Barron's last question, why did faith unsettle him so much, hung in the room like a storm cloud, heavy and ominous. It wasn't an attack, not a shout or a jab, but a gentle prod that pierced deeper than any argument Graves had ever faced. The professor stood still, his hands gripping the edge of his desk, his mind racing to regain the upper hand. He couldn't let this stand. Losing wasn't an option, not to a student, not in his own kingdom. He straightened, his posture rigid, his eyes narrowing as he studied Barron. The boy sat there unshaken, his towering frame a silent challenge. Graves inhaled deeply, forcing calm into his veins. He debated fiercer opponents. He reminded himself, priests with decades of doctrine, philosophers with libraries of theory, and he'd always emerged unscathed. This was different, though. Barron wasn't fighting to win. He was fighting to question, and that made him a puzzle Graves couldn't solve. The professor turned away from Barron, facing the class instead, his voice steady but lower than usual. Faith didn't bother him, he insisted. It was what people did with it that lit a fire in his gut. Ignorance cloaked as piety, violence excused by divine will, oppression waved away with a prayer. These were the crimes he couldn't stomach. He paced slowly, his words gaining strength, painting a picture of a world where belief became a shield for the worst of humanity. His tone sharpened, his gestures grew broader, as if he could reclaim the room by sheer force of will. He was the champion of thought, the slayer of illusions, and he wouldn't let a 19-year-old unravel that. But Barron watched him, his gaze steady, his silence louder than any rebuttal. The professor's words were a fortress, but Barron didn't storm it, he slipped through the cracks. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, almost reflective, yet it carried a weight that filled the room. Some abused faith, he acknowledged, just as others twisted science or power to ugly ends. History was littered with examples, experiments gone wrong, wars sparked by ambition, ideas warped into atrocities. Yet Graves did discard those entirely. He separated the misuse from the essence, sifting truth from distortion. Why couldn't he do the same with faith? A murmur rustled through the class, a ripple of realization that tightened the air. Graves paused, his hands clenching briefly before loosening. He turned back to his desk, gripping its edge again, his knuckles whitening. The boy's logic was simple, too simple, he thought, but it stuck like a splinter under his skin. He couldn't shake it. For years, he'd built his crusade on a single truth. Faith was a flaw, a weakness to be exposed. Now that truth wobbled, and the sensation was foreign, unsettling. He pushed off the desk, packing again, his mind a whirlwind of counterarguments he couldn't quite grasp. The students watched, their eyes darting between the two figures. This wasn't the usual spectacle, Graves tearing through a stuttering freshman or a smug graduate student. This was raw, unscripted, a battle where the lines of victory blurred. Barron didn't raise his voice, didn't gesture wildly or plead. He sat there, a pillar of calm, letting his words do the work. And they worked. Graves felt it, the shift in the room, the way attention tilted toward Barron, the way his own authority frayed at the edges. He hated it. He hated losing, hated the doubt creeping into his chest, hated the mirror this boy held up to his face. He stopped packing, turning sharply to Barron. His question had been a hook, and now Graves was caught on it. Why didn't he believe? The thought gnawed at him, a whisper he'd silenced years ago, buried under layers of logic and scorn. He didn't owe anyone an answer, not his students, not this kid, not himself. Yet the silence stretched, heavy and expectant, demanding something he wasn't sure he could give. His fingers tapped the desk, a restless rhythm, as he wrestled with the urge to deflect, to strike back, to end this on his terms. The room held its breath. Graves had always been the one asking, the one dissecting, the one standing over the wreckage of others' ideas. Now he was the one dissected, his certainty laid bare for all to see. Barron didn't push, didn't gloat. He waited, his presence a quiet force that refused to bend. The professor's mind raced back through his life, through moments he'd locked away. A childhood shadowed by rigid rules, a loss that left him hollow, a vow to never trust anything he couldn't touch. Those were his reasons, his fuel, but he'd never spoken them aloud. He wouldn't now. The mirror Graves had avoided for so long was cracking, and Barron wielded the hammer. The professor's chest tightened, not with anger but with something stranger, uncertainty. He'd spent decades dismantling faith, but today, faith was dismantling him. The students sensed it, their stillness a testament to the shift. This wasn't about winning anymore, it was about something bigger, something personal, something Graves couldn't escape. The storm was building and its peak was still to come. The lecture hall at Stanford University buzzed with attention so thick it could have choked the air. Dr. Leonard Graves, the titan of reason, stood at the edge of his desk, his hands restless, his mind a battlefield of its own making. Barron Trump, the unassuming giant in the center of the room, had turned the tables with a force no one saw coming, not even Graves himself. This wasn't just a clash of ideas anymore. It was a tempest, a storm so wild and unpredictable that its climax promised to shatter everything in its path. Something colossal was brewing, a revelation so staggering it would leave scars on everyone who witnessed it, and the buildup was as thrilling as it was terrifying. Graves had never lost control, not in this room, not in his career, not in his life. He'd faced down every challenger with the precision of a surgeon and the ferocity of a lion, cutting through their arguments until they lay in tatters at his feet. His lectures were his empire, his words his weapons, and he wielded them with a mastery that left no room for doubt. But today, doubt crept in, a shadow he couldn't banish. Barron's question, why didn't he believe, echoed in his skull, louder with every passing second. It wasn't a taunt or a trap, it was an invitation, and that made it worse. It forced him to look inward, a place he'd avoided for years. He stood there staring at nothing, the weight of the room pressing against him. The students watched, their eyes wide, their breaths shallow, as if they could sense the fracture forming in their professor's armor. Graves tapped his fingers against the desk again, a nervous tick he hadn't noticed until now. He wasn't sure how long he lingered in that silence, seconds, minutes, an eternity, but it stretched on, heavy and suffocating. His mind churned, pulling up memories he'd buried deep. A church pew hard against his back, a voice preaching fire and guilt, a moment when the world went dark and no prayer brought it back. Those were his ghosts, his reasons, and they clawed at him now, demanding to be seen. Finally, he moved. He cleared his throat, straightening, his posture snapping back into place like a soldier called to attention. His voice came out quieter than usual, rough around the edges, lacking its usual polish. He didn't know, he admitted, not why he rejected faith, not entirely. It wasn't a grand rebuttal, not a clever twist of logic. It was raw, honest, human, and it stunned the room into deeper silence. Graves wasn't the man of absolutes they knew, not in that moment. He was something else, vulnerable, exposed, a figure stripped of his invincible shell. Barron didn't react with triumph. He didn't smirk or nod smugly. He sat there, his hands still clasped, his face unreadable as if the confession was enough. The students, though, stirred. A few shifted in their seats, others exchanged glances, the air buzzing with unspoken questions. This wasn't the Graves they'd signed up for, the ruthless debater, the destroyer of dreams. This was a man caught off guard, a titan stumbling under a weight he hadn't expected to carry. The shift was palpable, the balance tipping further toward Barron, who wielded his calm like a weapon sharper than any shout. Graves felt it too, the loss of command, the erosion of his throne. He couldn't let it stand. He straightened fully, his voice hardening as he dismissed the class. The words came out clipped, abrupt, a signal that this was over, at least for now. The students hesitated, unsure if the moment had truly ended, then slowly gathered their bags, filing out in a hush. No one chattered about trivial things, no weekend plans, no test prep. They were lost in thought, replaying the scene, digesting the impossible. Graves had faltered, and Barron had pushed him there without breaking a sweat. As the room emptied, Barron rose, slinging his bag over his shoulder. He moved toward the door, his stride steady, his presence towering yet understated. Just as he reached the exit, Graves' voice cut through the quiet, stopping him cold. The professor called his name, a single word that carried more weight than any lecture. Barron turned, meeting Graves' gaze across the emptying hall. The older man studied him, his eyes searching, his mind still wrestling with the day's upheaval. He'd had this fight 1,000 times, he said, and never once had he lost the reins, not until now. The admission hung there heavy with meaning. Graves shook his head slightly, a rare crack in his composure widening. Barron hadn't tried to dominate, hadn't swung for victory, and that was what threw him. It wasn't about winning, Barron had said earlier, and now that truth echoed back. The professor exhaled, his shoulders slumping just enough to notice. Barron considered the words, then offered a simple nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, not gloating, before turning and walking out. The door swung shut behind him, leaving Graves alone in the silence. He stood there staring at the empty room, the whiteboard still proclaiming its topic, faith in the modern world. The irony wasn't lost on him. For years he'd torn apart beliefs, reduced them to ash, certain he held the only truth worth having. Now that certainty wavered. Maybe faith was a lie, a crutch, a fairy tale, but maybe it was. For the first time he didn't know, and that not knowing gnawed at him, a splinter he couldn't pull free. The storm had broken, and its fallout was just beginning to settle over him, over the class, over everything he'd built. The lecture hall at Stanford University stood empty now, but its walls seemed to hum with the echoes of what had just transpired. Dr. Leonard Graves remained rooted by his desk, the silence pressing against him like a physical force, while Barron Trump's departure left a void that pulsed with unanswered questions. What had happened wasn't just a debate or a lecture gone off script. It was a cataclysm, a collision so profound it promised to rewrite the rules of everything Graves held dear. The greatest shock was still out there, hovering like a shadow, ready to drop and shatter the world when least expected. But even now, the aftermath carried a weight that refused to lift. Graves stared at the door Barron had walked through, his mind replaying every moment, every word, every glance. He'd faced countless foes, preachers with fire in their eyes, scholars armed with centuries of text, students desperate to prove their worth, and he'd crushed them all, leaving their arguments in ruins. His classroom had been his battlefield, his intellect his sword, and he'd wielded it with a precision that bordered on art. Victory was his birthright, defeat a foreign language he'd never bothered to learn. Until today. Today, that sword had dulled, its edge blunted by a boy who didn't even swing back. He moved slowly, sinking into the chair behind his desk, his hands resting on its surface. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier, as if the ghosts of his past had slipped in to join him. He saw them in flashes, a childhood spent under the weight of sermons, a father's voice thundering about sin, a mother's prayers that went unanswered when death came knocking. Those were the roots of his war on faith, the fuel that drove him to tear it down wherever it stood. He never told anyone, never let those wounds breathe, but Barron's question had ripped them open, raw and bleeding. His fingers traced the edge of a notebook, a mindless motion as his thoughts spiraled. He'd always seen faith as a weakness, a surrender to fear or laziness, a refusal to face the world as it was. He'd built his life on reason, on what could be seen and measured, on a truth he could hold in his hands. Barron hadn't disproved that, no one could, but he'd turned it upside down. What if faith wasn't just blind trust? What if it was a strength, a choice, a lens Graves had never considered? The idea clawed at him, unfamiliar and unwelcome, but impossible to ignore. Outside, the campus buzzed with life, students rushing to their next classes, laughter drifting through the halls. But inside, time stood still. Graves leaned back, his eyes drifting to the whiteboard. Faith in the modern world, it read, a question he'd posed 100 times, always with the same answer. It was a myth, a relic, a lie. Now that answer felt hollow. Barron hadn't preached or pleaded, he'd simply asked, and that asking had done more damage than any sermon ever could. Graves hated it, hated the uncertainty, hated the way it lingered, hated the way it made him feel small. He thought of the students, their faces etched in his memory. They'd seen it too, the crack in his armor the moment he'd faltered. For years, they'd watched him dismantle their peers, their beliefs, their hopes, and they'd either feared him or revered him for it. Today, though, they'd seen something else. A man who didn't have all the answers, a titan brought low by a question he couldn't deflect. Would they talk about it? Would it spread, whispers in the halls, posts online, a story growing legs until it outgrew the room? The thought tightened his chest, but he pushed it aside. He wasn't finished, not yet. Barron's final words echoed back. Faith wasn't about winning. Graves snorted softly, a bitter sound. Winning was everything, he'd built his life on it, yet Barron hadn't played that game. He stood there, steady and sure, not to conquer but to challenge, not to destroy but to reflect. That was the difference, the thing Graves couldn't grasp. He'd called it rhetoric, dismissed it as a trick, but it stuck with him, a thorn he couldn't pluck out. The boy had walked away, leaving Graves with nothing to fight, nothing to tear down, just a mirror he couldn't look away from. He rose, packing the room now, his steps slow but restless. The silence mocked him, amplifying the questions he'd dodged for decades. Why didn't he believe? Why did faith gnaw at him, drive him to this endless crusade? He told himself it was about truth, about protecting the world from delusion, but now that felt thin, a shield too flimsy to hold. Maybe it was personal, maybe it always had been. A rebellion against a past he couldn't change, a wall against a pain he couldn't face. The realization settled over him, heavy and cold, and for the first time he didn't push it away. The echoes of that day wouldn't fade. They'd linger in the students' minds, in the air of this room, in the corners of Graves' thoughts. Something had shifted, not just in the lecture hall, but in him. He wasn't broken, not defeated, but he was changed, whether he liked it or not. Barron had planted a seed, and it was growing, its roots cracking through the stone of his certainty. The storm might have passed, but its echoes promised more. A reckoning still to come, a truth still to surface, a clash that wasn't over yet. The echoes of that fateful day in the Stanford lecture hall refused to fade, lingering like smoke after a blaze. Dr. Leonard Graves had walked away from the encounter with Barron Trump, but the encounter hadn't walked away from him. It clung to his thoughts, a relentless shadow that followed him through the corridors, into his office, and even into the quiet of his home. What had begun as a routine challenge, a professor flexing his intellectual might against a student, had spiraled into something far greater, a fire that threatened to consume everything he'd built. The most astonishing twist was still lurking, a revelation so wild it would turn the ashes of this clash into a wildfire no one could extinguish. Graves tried to shake it off. He returned to his routine, lectures, papers, debates, determined to reclaim his throne. His next class came quickly, the room filling with familiar faces and a few new ones, all eager for the spectacle he'd perfected over decades. He stood at the front, sleeves rolled up, his smirk back in place, ready to wield his logic like a blade once more. The topic was different, ethics this time, but the game was the same. He scanned the room, hunting for weakness, for belief he could unravel. His eyes landed on a girl in the third row, a rosary peeking out from her collar. Perfect. He launched into his questions, his voice sharp, his rhythm unrelenting, and she stumbled just as he'd planned. The victory should have felt sweet. It didn't. The room applauded his precision, his dismantling of her shaky defense, but the triumph rang hollow. He paced, his hands restless, his mind drifting back to Barron, back to that calm, unyielding presence, that question he couldn't bury. Why didn't he believe? The girl's faltering answers faded into noise as his thoughts churned. He won, yes, but it wasn't the same. The fire that once fueled him, tearing down faith, exposing its flaws, flickered now, its heat dulled by a doubt he couldn't name. He dismissed the class early, ignoring the surprised glances, and retreated to his office. There, surrounded by books and awards, he sank into his chair, staring at the shelves that chronicled his career. Each volume, each plaque, was a testament to his war on illusion, his crusade for reason. He'd built this life brick by brick, a fortress against the chaos of belief, and it had held strong until now. Barron's words had slipped through the cracks, igniting something he'd smothered long ago. He pulled a drawer open, fishing out a faded photograph he hadn't touched in years. A younger Graves stared back, standing beside a stern-faced man in a black suit, a Bible tucked under his arm. His father. The memory hit hard, sermons that echoed like thunder, rules that choked, a faith that demanded everything and gave nothing when he needed it most. He shoved the photo back, slamming the drawer shut. That was why he fought, because faith had failed him, because it had left him alone when the world caved in. His mother's death had been the breaking point, her prayers unanswered, her hopes snuffed out. He vowed then to never trust anything he couldn't prove, to rip apart every lie that promised salvation. It was personal, yes, but it was bigger than that. It was a mission, a shield against a world too cruel to trust. Barron had no right to dig that up, no right to make him question it. Yet the question burned, rekindling a fire Graves thought he'd extinguished. He stood packing the office, his steps quick and uneven. The campus outside hummed with life, but he barely heard it. His mind raced, piecing together Barron's argument, testing it against his own. Faith as strength, not weakness. Faith as choice, not surrender. Faith as something real, not just a ghost in the dark. He snorted, shaking his head. It was nonsense, pretty words wrapped around nothing. He'd heard it before from priests and poets, and he'd crushed it every time. But Barron hadn't preached. He'd asked, and that asking had lit a spark Graves couldn't stamp out. The fire grew as days passed. Students whispered about the clash, rumors spreading, stories twisting. Some said Barron had humiliated Graves, others that Graves had let him off easy. Clips surfaced online, shaky phone videos from the lecture, and they spread like wildfire. Comments piled up, some cheering Barron's quiet defiance, others mocking Graves for losing his edge. The professor saw it all, his jaw tightening with every scroll. He wasn't finished, not by a long shot. He'd reclaim his ground, prove his point, silence the noise. But deep down, a flicker of something else burned. Curiosity, unease, a need to know why Barron's words wouldn't let him go. He returned to the lecture hall the next week, the room packed again, the air thick with expectation. Barron was there, seated near the center, his cross necklace gleaming faintly against his chest. Graves' eyes locked on it, a flare of irritation surging through him. This wasn't over. He launched into the lesson, his voice sharper, his questions fiercer, but his gaze kept drifting to Barron. The boy sat upright, listening, his face unreadable just as before. Graves pushed harder, targeting others, but watching him, waiting for a reaction. None came. The fire rekindled fully now, not just anger but a challenge, a need to confront this anomaly head-on. The professor's resolve hardened. He wouldn't let this end quietly. Barron had started something, and Graves would finish it on his terms in his arena. The stakes were higher now, the clash personal, the outcome uncertain. The fire was back, and it burned hotter than ever, promising a showdown that would leave no one untouched. The Stanford lecture hall buzzed with a tension that had grown beyond its walls, a storm swelling into something unstoppable. Dr. Leonard Graves had reignited his fire, his resolve stealing into a weapon sharper than ever, while Barron Trump remained the enigma at the heart of it all, a quiet giant whose presence alone threatened to topple an empire. What had started as a single encounter was now a saga, a scandalous war of wills that gripped the campus, the internet, and Graves, every waking moment. The greatest shock still loomed, a twist so explosive it would rewrite the story entirely, but the path to it wound through a battlefield neither man could avoid. Graves threw himself back into his work with a ferocity that startled even his colleagues. His lectures became fiercer, his arguments tighter, his smirk a blade honed to cut deeper than before. Students packed the room, drawn by the rumors, the videos, the whispers of his clash with Barron. They wanted the show, the professor at his peak, dismantling faith with surgical precision. But they also wanted Barron, the wild card who'd shaken him. Graves felt their eyes, their expectation, and it fueled him. He wouldn't just reclaim his throne. He'd fortify it, brick by brick, until no one dared question him again. Barron attended every class, his presence a constant spark in Graves' peripheral vision. The cross necklace gleamed faintly, a silent taunt, but Barron never spoke unless called on. When he did, his answers were measured, thoughtful, never aggressive, yet they landed like grenades, subtle but devastating. Graves targeted him less directly now, wary of another public unraveling, but the tension simmered beneath every lecture. The professor circled other students, tearing through their ideas, but his mind stayed locked on Barron, plotting the next move, the final strike. This wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a duel, and Graves intended to win. Outside the classroom, the story grew legs. Social media erupted with takes. Some hailed Barron as a hero of faith. Others painted Graves as a bully past his prime. Clips of the original clash racked up views, dissected by bloggers, debated in forums, memed into absurdity. Graves scrolled through it all, his jaw clenched, his pride stinging. He wasn't losing, not yet, but the narrative was slipping, twisting into something he couldn't control. Colleagues noticed too, their glances lingering, their whispers trailing him down the halls. He brushed it off, but the pressure mounted, a weight he carried into every room. He prepared meticulously for the next big lecture, the topic chosen with intent, the limits of belief. The whiteboard loomed behind him as students filed in, the room overflowing, chairs dragged in from other halls. Barron took his usual seat, his height making him impossible to miss, his calm a stark contrast to the buzzing crowd. Graves stood at the front, his sleeves rolled up, his stance wide, ready to reclaim the arena. He launched into it, belief as a construct, a crutch, a flaw in human wiring. His voice boomed, his gestures sharp, his logic a battering ram. Students scribbled notes, some nodded, others squirmed, but all felt the intensity radiating from him. He didn't call on Barron, not yet. He worked the room first, dismantling weaker targets, building momentum. A boy in a baseball cap fumbled over morality's roots. A girl with a hijab struggled to defend tradition. Graves tore through them, his smirk widening, his rhythm unstoppable. The crowd leaned in, hooked, sensing the professor at his peak. But his eyes kept flicking to Barron, waiting, baiting. The boy sat still, listening, his cross catching the light. Graves pushed harder, his argument peaking. Belief without evidence was a delusion, a trap, a surrender to chaos. He paced, his voice rising, daring anyone to challenge him. The room held its breath, sensing the moment building. A student near the back, a philosophy major with sharp eyes, raised her hand, her question cutting through the air. "What about doubt?" she asked. "Didn't certainty carry its own risks?" Graves paused, his smirk faltering for a heartbeat, then recovered. Doubt was his ally, he countered. Reason thrived on it, while faith choked on it. He turned, his gaze locking on Barron at last. The arena was set, the challenge unspoken but screaming between them. Barron met his eyes, steady as ever, and the tension snapped taut, a wire ready to break. Graves pivoted, redirecting his fire. He asked the class, did belief make sense in a world of facts? Hands crept up, answers stumbled out, but none satisfied him. He was building to something, a trap he'd sprung 100 times. Then Barron's hand rose, slow and deliberate, the first time he'd volunteered. The room stilled, every eye swiveling to him. Graves nodded, his smirk tightening, ready to pounce. Barron's response came calm and clear. Facts didn't erase meaning, they framed it. Belief wasn't about ignoring evidence, it was about seeing beyond it. The words landed, simple but heavy, and the crowd murmured, a ripple of awe spreading. Graves felt the shift, the ground tilting again. He countered fast, meaning was a human invention, not a cosmic gift, but Barron's point lingered unshaken. The professor's fire burned hotter, his mind racing to reclaim control. The arena was alive, the clash roaring back to life, and neither man would yield. The stakes soared, the tension coiled, and the promise of something bigger, something earth-shattering, loomed closer than ever. The Stanford Lecture Hall had become a crucible, a furnace where Dr. Leonard Graves and Barron Trump forged their clash into something legendary. The air thrummed with anticipation, every seat filled, every breath held, as the professor fought to reclaim his dominion, and the student stood firm, an unyielding force that refused to bend. What was unfolding wasn't just a battle of ideas, it was a breaking point, a moment so intense it teetered on the edge of collapse. The most shocking revelation hovered just out of reach, a thunderbolt waiting to strike, and the buildup pushed the tension to a razor's edge, promising a fallout no one could predict. Graves stood at the front, his presence commanding, his mind a storm of strategy and fury. He turned the room into his arena again, his voice a weapon, his logic a shield, determined to bury Barron's defiance once and for all. The last lecture had ended with Barron's words ringing in the air, belief as a lens beyond facts, and Graves couldn't let it stand. He'd spent days dissecting it, crafting a counterattack, hunting his argument until it gleamed like steel. This wasn't just about winning. It was about survival, about proving he was still the titan he'd always been. Failure wasn't an option. Not here, not now. The room buzzed as students settled in, their eyes darting between Graves and Barron. The topic scrawled across the whiteboard, reason versus revelation, set the stage for a showdown. Graves launched into it, his voice booming, his gestures wide. Reason was the bedrock of progress, he argued, the light that banished shadows. Revelation, faith's flimsy backbone, crumbled under scrutiny, a relic of a weaker age. He paced, his rhythm relentless, tearing through centuries of belief with a ferocity that left students scribbling furiously. This was Graves at his peak, the master of his craft, and the crowd felt it, leaning into every word. Barron sat near the center, his cross necklace a faint glimmer, his posture steady. He didn't fidget or flinch, didn't scribble notes or glance away. He listened, his face a mask of calm, absorbing every barb Graves threw. The professor noticed, his eyes flicking to him, his fire stoked by that stillness. He pushed harder, targeting others, but aiming at Barron, dismantling a boy's shaky defense of prayer, shredding a girl's appeal to mystery. The room crackled, the energy rising, as Graves built his case. Faith was a house of straw, and he was the wind that would blow it down. Then it came, the moment he'd waited for. He turned to Barron, his smirk sharp, his voice slicing through the air. He asked the class, could anyone defend revelation without falling into fantasy? Hands hesitated, then Barron's rose, slow and sure. The room stilled, a collective breath held. Graves nodded, his eyes narrowing, ready to crush whatever came next. Barron's response rolled out, steady and deep. Revelation wasn't about proof. It was about trust, a bridge between what was known and what couldn't be grasped. It didn't deny reason, it completed it. The words hit like a wave, simple yet unshakable, and the crowd stirred, murmurs rippling through. Graves pounced, his counter swift. Trust without evidence was a leap into darkness, a surrender to delusion. He paced faster, his voice rising, dismantling Barron's bridge plank by plank. But Barron didn't waver. His hand rose again, and Graves, caught mid-stride, nodded sharply. Barron pressed on. Reason had limits, gaps it couldn't fill. Trust stepped in where facts fell short, not as weakness but as courage. The room buzzed, students shifting, some nodding, others frowning, all hooked. Graves felt the tide slipping, his control fraying. He fired back. Courage didn't make something true, it just made it feel good. He tore into it, his logic a battering ram, but Barron's calm held, a wall he couldn't breach. The professor's chest tightened, his fire turning inward. He'd faced this before, Barron's quiet strength, his refusal to break, and it gnawed at him, exposing cracks he couldn't seal. The students saw it too, their eyes wide, their whispers growing. Graves pushed harder, his voice booming now, demanding the class see reason's supremacy. But the breaking point loomed, and he couldn't stop it. A girl in the back, the philosophy major, raised her hand, her question a dagger. What if reason missed something bigger? Graves froze, his smirk gone, his mind racing. He answered, reason missed nothing worth having, but his voice lacked its edge, his certainty hollowing out. Barron watched, silent now, his presence a spotlight on Graves' unraveling. The professor's hands clenched, his past roaring back. Those sermons, that loss, that vow, and he realized he wasn't just fighting Barron. He was fighting himself, and he was losing. The room tilted, the tension snapping. Graves dismissed the class, his words curt, his posture stiff. Students filed out, buzzing with awe, but he stayed, staring at the whiteboard, the fight draining from him. The breaking point had come, not in a shout or a fall, but in a quiet collapse, a mirror he couldn't shatter. The storm was peaking, and its final blow was still to land. The Stanford lecture hall stood silent now, but its emptiness roared with the weight of what had happened. Dr. Leonard Graves lingered at his desk, the whiteboard behind him, a mocking relic of his last stand. Reason versus revelation, a battle he'd lost in ways he couldn't yet fathom. Barron Trump had walked out with the others, his towering figure fatting into the crowd, but his impact remained, a force that had stripped Graves bare and left him staring into the abyss of his own making. What had unfolded wasn't just a clash, it was a revelation, A twist so staggering, so earth-shattering, it redefined everything. The fire had burned out, and from its ashes rose a truth neither man could have predicted. Graves sank into his chair, his hands trembling slightly, his mind a tangle of rage, doubt, and something softer, something he hadn't felt in years. The breaking point had come, not with a dramatic fall or a public defeat, but with a quiet unraveling that left him exposed. He fought Barron with every weapon in his arsenal: logic, scorn, experience. And still, the boy had stood firm, his calm a mirror that reflected Graves' own cracks. The students had seen it, the campus had felt it, and now the world beyond buzzed with it, clips and rumors spreading like wildfire. But the real shock, the one that would haunt him forever, wasn't in the lecture hall. It was coming, and it would hit harder than anything he'd faced. He replayed the clash, every moment etched in his memory. Barron's words, trust as courage, faith as a bridge, had pierced him, but it was more than that. It was the way he'd asked, the way he'd waited, the way he'd refused to fight for victory. Graves had spent decades tearing down belief, certain he held the only truth, but Barron hadn't countered with dogma or desperation. He offered a question: why didn't Graves believe? And that question had burrowed deep, unearthing a past he'd buried under layers of reason. The sermons, the loss, the vow, they flooded back, raw and relentless, and he couldn't push them away anymore. He rose, packing the room, his steps heavy, his chest tight. The whiteboard loomed, its words a taunt. Reason versus revelation. He'd chosen reason, built his life on it, but now it felt like a cage, a wall he'd trapped himself behind. Barron hadn't just challenged his ideas, he'd challenged his soul, and that was the wound that wouldn't heal. The professor stopped, staring at the empty seats, imagining the students' faces, wide-eyed, whispering, watching him crack. They witnessed a titan stumble, and they'd carry that story with them, a legend growing beyond his control. Then it came, the revelation, the twist no one saw coming. A knock broke the silence, sharp and unexpected. Graves turned, frowning, as the door creaked open. A colleague stepped in, a philosophy professor named Carter, his face pale, his hands clutching a phone. He didn't speak right away, just held out the device. A video paused on the screen. Graves took it, his brow furrowing, and pressed play. The footage was grainy, a shaky recording from outside the lecture hall, timestamped just after the last class. Barron stood there alone, his back to the camera, his head bowed. Then he turned, and the cross necklace glinted, except it wasn't a cross. It was a locket, small and silver, and as he opened it, a tiny photo slipped into view. A woman's face, smiling, achingly familiar. Graves' breath caught, his heart slamming against his ribs. He knew that face, his mother, younger, radiant, a memory he'd locked away. The video cut off, but Carter spoke, his voice low. Barron had been asking around quietly about Graves' past. He found the photo in an old university archive, a file from Graves' early days as a student before he'd built his walls. The locket wasn't a symbol of faith, it was a tether to her, to a loss Barron had somehow understood. The boy hadn't come to fight, he'd come to heal, to reach across the divide Graves had spent a lifetime widening. The room spun, the revelation crashing over him. Barron hadn't mocked his faith, he'd honored it in a way Graves couldn't comprehend. The cross wasn't a prop, it was a bridge to a pain they shared, a mother's love neither could reclaim. Graves sank back into his chair, the phone slipping from his hands, his eyes burning. He'd seen Barron as an enemy, a threat, but the boy had seen him, a man broken by loss, hiding behind reason. The clash hadn't been about winning, it was about this, about forcing Graves to face what he'd fled. He sat there, the silence deafening as the truth settled. The fire was gone, replaced by something rawer, grief, wonder, a flicker of something like faith. He didn't believe in God, not yet, maybe not ever, but he believed in this, in a boy who'd seen through him, in a moment that had stripped him bare and given him back something he'd lost. The students would talk, the world would spin the story, but this was his alone, a revelation that didn't prove faith or reason, but something messier, something human. Days later, he'd see Barron again, passing in the hall. Their eyes would meet, a nod exchanged, no words needed. The locket would gleam and Graves would feel it, a crack in his wall, a light seeping through. The clash was over, but its echoes would linger. A scandal turned sacred, a humiliation turned holy. The world would never know the full story, but he would, and that was enough. If you enjoyed this story, check out another video with an even more amazing tale. There's always something exciting waiting for you on our channel. And don't forget, more wonderful stories are coming soon. Hit the subscribe button so you won't miss out on any of our upcoming adventures.